one of my favourite parts of the podcast is what else have you been watching? Where I get to ask Dan Barrett, what else have you been watching?
Curb Your Enthusiasm. So
I
Seinfeld.
know of it.
Did I say Seinfeld then? Simon.
You
Sorry,
did.
that's Seinfeld brain. Simon Foster, who is not the American stand-up comedian named Jerry Seinfeld. Simon Foster. When I cook dinner, my favorite thing to do is I get my iPad, I open it up, I load up the app, I start streaming a show called Curb Your Enthusiasm, and I watch that while I cook. I do that for two reasons.
Interesting.
And I've been doing this for years. Okay, look, I do it for two reasons.
I couldn't do that.
One, it's a very funny, entertaining program. Okay, but two, there's a thing with Curb Your Enthusiasm where you don't actually need to watch the show from beginning to end in one sitting. You could watch the first 10 minutes of an episode, okay, and then just come back to it a few days later and watch the second half, and you're still going to have a perfectly entertaining experience with it.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know, but there's just something where there's certainly a narrative to every episode, so don't feel that I'm not saying that, but there's just something where every scene on that is just so standalone, okay, and always,
yes, that's true.
Almost tells its own story within every short scene. That it works, and there's no short scenes on Curb either. Every scene runs a couple of minutes. It's an opportunity for some proper improv to be brought to the screen. So it's great for cooking because you can kind of you watch Curb for as long as it takes to cook the meal, okay, and then it's done, and you feel perfectly happy pressing pause because we come back to it and just be picking up that experience again.
That's quite a skill.
Yeah.
I can't do that. I can't be distracted by things in my ears or noise in the background when I'm cooking. What about the big knives and the temperatures and all that sort of stuff? I'm very much I need to have sole focus on what I'm doing. So that's quite a skill, Dan Barrett. You surprise me no end by that admittance.
If I'm watching the anger contained in an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm, I need a knife in my hand. It's just important. It's part of the process. Look,
good.
I've been doing that for years, and I had a very awkward situation where the new season of Curb came back. It's very last, and I was 2/3 of the way through the series. I was just starting season 10 when they came back, because they were making the show up until 2012, 13, I think, and then took a hiatus until 2020, and it came back. So ostensibly, Larry David was finished with the show, and then they just kept on asking him, "Are you coming back?" And he started thinking, I kind of want to come back and do some more. So he came back and did some more. But the show had finished years and years ago. But I was midway through, and I thought, well, no, I'm going to finish out the run of the show, and then I'll just catch up to where we're at with the season. But obviously I didn't cook enough dinners during the last month and a half because I just fell behind. And so I finally caught up, but I had 9 episodes.
That's the woman's job, Dan. That's the woman's job.
Okay, sorry. Okay. But anyway, I'm not going there. But so I ended up having to binge watch this entire last season of Curb Your Enthusiasm all over the course of 3 days just to catch up with it, so I could watch the last episode on that final day, which is important to me because I've spent so much of my life now watching Curb Your Enthusiasm. I mean, this is a show that premiered back in 2000, and I've been watching it this entire time.
Wow.
Okay, eagerly looking forward to it. So seeing the final episode, big moment for me. I got to say, I loved it. TV shows aren't meant to end is probably the big thing to realize going into any series. So a final episode is always built to be a statement about the program that was, rather than necessarily finishing off a narrative. And anyone who's looking for a narrative closure with a TV show finale is just approaching it wrong because, the narrative's never going to be a satisfactory conclusion, and nor will it feel like a defining statement about the show that you've been watching. The best things are always where it ends with some sort of a statement as to, this is how we've spent our time together. What did you think? Okay, and the final statement of this show was that the show you have been watching has been about one thematic idea the entire time, which is that Larry David, the star of the show, has never learned a single lesson. And as you watch that final episode of Seinfeld, of Curb Your Enthusiasm, it just has all these echoes to the final episode of Seinfeld, which is, as far as the public's concerned, the one thing that Larry David just truly just messed up in his life. Okay,
so yeah, that's true. Okay, that's an interesting perspective.
So as he finishes his final program, it's kind of a judgment on Larry David. Did he learn the lessons of what he did with the Seinfeld finale, or is he going to screw this up as well? And if the entire thematic idea of Curb Your Enthusiasm has been he's never learned his lesson, How does the show deal with that? And their final episode deals with it by him not learning his lesson. He plays out the thing just like the final episode of Seinfeld did, but in a Curb Your Enthusiasm vibe, okay, which is not that far removed. And it just plays out the exact same way. So you reach the very end of the episode where, much like at the end of Seinfeld, Larry David is sentenced to a year prison, and he's sitting there in a cell by himself. And much like at the end of Seinfeld, where they get held up with talking about like the distance between buttons on a shirt, and that some buttons are just too high on a shirt and whatnot, which is the conversation from the very first episode of Seinfeld. Larry David's seen in his cell looking down at his pants, and they start tensing up, much like in one of the very earliest episodes of Curb Your Enthusiasm, where he's concerned about a pants tent. So it's him not learning any lessons. But the show ends with Jerry Seinfeld, who'd been in the final episode of Curb, popping his head in saying, "Hey, Larry, it's okay. You can come out of prison." And we don't need to go into walk on him out. But it's basically Jerry Seinfeld who came to Larry's defense at the end, got him out of prison. Okay, so Larry did not learn anything through the entire course of the show, although the last episode does play things out slightly different to that Seinfeld episode. So you're left with a question: did Larry David, the artist, learn anything through life, or is it just the character that never learned anything? And that's kind of the fun dichotomy of it all.
He's never not great with structure and great with building these episodes around this greater structure in terms of the narrative, and I think that's what he's done there, and it's a brilliant piece of sort of understanding you've given us into the final episode, of which I've seen most of. I haven't quite seen the end of it yet, and I guess because it came out right when I had my first child, I didn't have the time or didn't have the inclination to watch the Larry David Curb Your Enthusiasm back when it first came out. So I've only seen like maybe a dozen episodes over the whole year. Very funny, love watching it, just never been my thing. But I've got to say, the opening sequence in this finale on the plane is very, very funny and is a classic bit of Larry David Curb Your Enthusiasm comedy. So I guess, was there enough good things in the 12th season to warrant that season? Very often, you're thinking of the X-Files, you're thinking of some of these shows that come back, that very soon you realise that, well, there wasn't enough on the table there to really make this worthwhile. Do you think that season 12 of Curb Your Enthusiasm is a good thing?
Look, I mean, the X-Files went off the rails, season 5 or 6. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Look, I would definitely say that the last couple of episodes of the season, I think, are fantastic. There's an episode where Larry David is hung up and calling people the captain. Look, there's certainly things towards the end of that which, I had a lot of joy with. But, it's not a great season. But also, I'd say season 11 had a few, great moments and then, a few duds along the way. And, a Curb Your Enthusiasm dud episode is still better than most things on TV. But is it of the standard? I'm not too sure. And part of the challenge is season 10 of the program, the second season after they came back, the Mocha Joe season is the one. It is such a amazing season of television with so many great episodes in there that I think it was just hard for the show to live up to some of the heights that it really offered that year.
The first witness to take the stand in the finale too, Mocha Joe. Guy. What else have I been watching? I'm glad you asked. Also in cinemas this week is an animated film called Robot Dreams. It was nominated for the Best Animated Film Oscar at this year's Oscar ceremony. It tells the story set in this sort of alternate reality where a little bit like Zootopia, actually, the Disney film where animals live in a late 80s New York City. One of them, Dog, is a very lonely individual, decides to get a robot friend that he orders and constructs in his brownstone apartment. They become friends, but they become separated, and it's the two different journeys that these individuals take while always being consumed by the memories of each other, that makes for a very sweet, sometimes very sad, beautifully rendered in terms of animation story from director Pablo Berger, who a few years back made a film called Blanconievres, which was a sort of a black and white gothic retelling of Cinderella. So he loves sort of the fairy tale elements in his storytelling, but does stuff that's very different with it. Loved Robot Dreams. Maybe not, although it very much looks kid friendly. It does go to some dark places that might be a little bit too sad for kids, but there are moments that just absolutely soar as enjoyment reaches its peak throughout this. Great use of the song September in key moments to get the toe tapping and the heart swelling. So Robot Dreams is in limited release around Australia.
Yeah, so I've seen Robot Dreams, and I've got to come back to it because there were certainly elements that I really liked about it. But the one thing you didn't really mention is that this is a dialogue-free movie. And
Yes.
for a film that's about depression and isolation and loneliness, the fact there's no dialogue, which is absolutely a choice made to emphasize that. I just kind of found that even the scenes where the robot was hanging around with the dog hanging out with the robot, which was supposed to be fairly joyous, I don't know, I just kind of felt like just this overall, I don't know, just dark void that I was just facing into, which probably speaks to the quality of the movie I was watching, but at the same time, I just wasn't there for it at the time. So I'm going to have to come back. I'm going to have to be in a sunnier mood to watch that because things were getting bleak with me on that couch.
But what else have you been watching, Dan Barrett?
So, Simon, in the cinemas this week as well is well, I was going to ask you, the First Omen's playing in cinemas. How's that?
Yes. Okay, so we have with The First Omen one of those films that is an origin story, and by that I mean it takes place very much like the movie you and I disagree on, but Rogue One takes you right up to the beginning of the first Star Wars and New Hope stories. So does The First Omen. It tells of the birth of the Antichrist, who would become known as Damien, and the young American nun who goes to Rome to start her nunnery life, take her vows and give over her life to Christ, but who instead finds herself caught up in a narrative that may or may not sort of position her as the mother of the Antichrist, the return of the Antichrist. It's a beautiful looking film. This is far and away more polished than I expected. It has a great sort of European feel and look to it. The actress has an unusual name, and I really want to get it right, Nell Tiger Free as the young nun, she's terrific. The first half hour is almost plot point for plot point the same as the Sydney Sweeney film Immaculate, which is still in theatres. Very much the American nun heading to the nunnery in Rome, the convent, I should say, not the nunnery, and finding that things are going terribly. But then it goes off on its own path, and the ending is sort of that. I hate the term elevated horror because it suggests that some horror, is of a lower standard. This is just a great bit of horror storytelling, a real sort of old school religious shocker that I absolutely lapped up, and I thought it was a terrific film.
Yeah. Something I saw which is streaming on your TV and your various other devices, Simon, is Scoop, the new film that's debuted on Netflix. So, look, this is the behind-the-scenes story of the Newsnight interview with Prince Andrew, where he was confronted about his association with Jeffrey Epstein. The first 20, 30, maybe even 40 minutes of this is fantastic. The problem is that the back end of the film just doesn't really have anything to say after it's sort of established all these characters. There's this framework of it, like essentially it's really sort of structured around the lady that's responsible for the booking of guests on this BBC interview program. And she's someone who is, at least as framed in this movie, quite a bit more populist in the way that she thinks about the relationship with the audience than some of the more sort of strict news people that are working on the program. So she doesn't really feel as though she sort of fits in with everyone, and there's definitely that tension. And that's probably the strongest element of the film, I thought. So I kind of wish they'd played around with that a little bit more. And while it informs the character, I don't think it informs the film as much as I think it is intending to from the outset. as you get further into the movie, it starts to replace like that tension with maybe just a bit more of a celebration of the fact that you've got three women in sort of key roles putting this into the world. So you got this talent booker who does find herself on the outs as the story sort of develops. But then you've also got the executive producer of the program who's a woman, and then the host of the program who's a woman as well. And it kind of becomes this sort of very empty feeling celebration of, oh, it's great these women are in these sort of positions of power, but it doesn't really sort of interrogate them and move backwards and forwards with what's interesting about them, which is what's interesting about this woman and how she's sort of being squeezed out. Does she still have a future with Newsnight, even though she's delivered them like this amazing interview? Like, you don't really get a sense of any of that kind of thing. What does it mean for the executive producer to have like this tension existing on her staff? Is she someone of whom actually values that? Is she someone of whom feels that she's made a wrong choice with the person that she's hired to have such an antagonistic relationship with the rest of the people on the staff? Like, you don't get a feeling for any of that. And Gillian Anderson's kind of a bit of a nothing presence in as well as the host of the program. She's kind of just trotting out the Thatcher character she played in The Crown. For a season or so there. Like, I don't know. I really want us to like this a lot more. And there's certainly a lot going for the first half of it, but it just doesn't back it up with anything for the back half.
That's interesting because I sort of went the other way. I know that you and I have kind of poo-pooed the preponderance of sort of modern history dramatizations here on the podcast previously, the retelling of things that have just been in the headlines. I thought this took a really interesting point of view from the terms of the Billy Piper character, Sam McAllister, who is the talent finder that you're talking about, who finds herself with kind of a connection to the palace, and is able to get in first and get the Prince Andrew interview for the Gillian Anderson character and for the Newsnight show. I thought there was plenty at stake that wasn't gender-based when you talk about those three women. I thought that Romola Garai's character, the sort of the head of the executive producer of Newsnight, and Gillian Anderson's host, and the Billy Piper character, all had legitimately individual issues that needed to be addressed that weren't just about gender or weren't just about the issues they were going through and the issues they were kind of symbolic of or representative of in the context of this story. That said,
now, see, Simon,
yes, there's a strong sort of Me Too punch about this.
Sorry, can I just interrupt briefly? So I think that what you said is right, but it's very much, there's that tension with Billy Piper's character, which that is not about her gender at all. But there's a scene where she gets invited down to the set, and she's there with two other like important women on the program, and it's just the three of them on the set. And I think they even verbalize it at some point, which is, 10 years ago, they never would have, this wouldn't have happened. Okay. And it's from that point in that the rest of the movie gets framed through that scene. Like, that scene actually derails it all. So if they hadn't had that scene, I don't think I'd be reading as much into it as gender, but they put that on the table to set the table for what the rest of the film is. And so you can't view the rest of the film without seeing it through the prism of that scene. That's what it's there for.
Yeah, perhaps I think there's also a role to be played by the character at the palace, Prince Andrew's press secretary, the woman who sort of allows and has faith in Andrew to be to tell his own story and to clear his own name on air, and that sort of blind faith and blind sort of belief in the power of the monarchy and the power of them is also a really interesting point of view. And I guess if you're going to weigh in on the gender roles of those three women, sort of coming after Andrew and coming after the interview, you've also got to look at her gender in that role as well, which is open to interpretation. We can't not mention that Rufus Sewell is terrific as Prince Andrew, barely recognisable under a lot of makeup, and he has some he's such a buffoon in some of the stuff and some of the belief he has. And when what is it with photoshopping in movies until it always looks terrible when they photoshopped the young Rufus Sewell into the picture with Virginia, the young 17-year-old, that famous photo that he was caught with his arm around her. I actually found this very entertaining, which I didn't expect to. I thought it was going to be a little bit sort of kind of like a spotlight sort of movie where it just sort of showed the machinations as to how they got the interview. I thought they were all really interesting, sort of, and entertaining characters as well as telling a good story.
Yeah, I mean, I found that first half incredibly entertaining, but after that, it just kind of lost steam. I just don't think it really had anything that it needed to present. So I just kind of wish they'd sort of reframed at the beginning. And you talked about the lady that was the head of comms for Prince Andrew. If the film had
Yes.
been a juxtaposition between what her agenda was versus what Billie Piper's agenda was, and you can still focus on their respective stories through that, I think that might have been a more interesting way to approach that. Because, I mean, obviously, once that happens, there's fallout. So we see the impacts on Billie Piper's character once she sort of gets squeezed out. We'd then see the impacts on the comms director. Okay, but you don't really quite get that. Like, once the interview happens, it kind of happens. And at a certain point, the film just becomes, oh, well, you know, they've set it up, so now's the interview. But I think the actual interview itself is the least interesting part of this.
Interesting week. On what else have you been watching? There you go. That's an out. That didn't seem awkward at all. All right. Roll into the quizzes.
Okay, let's do this.